Hello and welcome. Today we're learning the basics of John the Ripper. Now, what is John the Ripper, you may be asking? It's a password cracking tool. In this example, we're going to crack 2 hashes. Now, before we begin, I want to explain what a hash is. A hash is a way of converting data of any length into data of a fixed length value. For example, we can make a password test123 and hash it using the MD5 hashing algorithm. As you can see, this is the hash and it has a certain length. Now let's make a different password with a very long length and hash it using the MD5 hashing algorithm. And as you can see, this is the hash and this is the length. If we compare these two, you can see that it has the same length. It doesn't matter what the original value is. It doesn't matter how long the original value is. The hash will always be the same length. Now, I want to mention that hashes is a one-way street. You cannot reverse this hash to try and get the original value. Now, before we begin cracking hashes, we first need to identify what hashing algorithm is being used for this hash. For that, we can use NameThatHash with the F flag and specify the file that contains the hash that we want to identify. Click enter, and as you can see, according to NameThatHash, our hash was made using the SHA-512 hashing algorithm. And as you can see, this is the format for John the Ripper. Using this information, we can start using John the Ripper. We can say John, use the format flag to specify the hashing algorithm being used. In our case, it's raw SHA-512. And use the word list flag to specify the word list being used. And finally, specifying the file containing the hash that we want to crack. And as you can see, John the Ripper is quite fast, mainly because we have a weak password. Now, I want to explain how John the Ripper works. John will convert every entry in our word list and hash it using the raw SHA-512 hashing algorithm. And then once it has that hash, it will compare it to the hash inside our file. And once it has a match, it knows the password and it will print it out. Now, I want to give an example of when NameThatHash is not 100% accurate in identifying the hashing algorithm being used. For example, let's identify the hashing algorithm being used in our hash2 file. And as you can see, according to NameThatHash, our hash was created using the SHA-512 hashing algorithm. Now, if we go along with this data and say John format raw SHA-512 word list and then specify the file containing the hash that we want to crack, you can see that we will get an error saying that this hash type has poor scalability. Now, the reason for this error is because we have the wrong hashing algorithm. So if you ever run into this problem, you would have to replace the hashing algorithm with other likely hashing algorithms being used. For example, you would try this one. If this doesn't work, you would try this one. If this one doesn't work, you would try this one, and so on. To save some time, I already know that the correct hashing algorithm being used is Whirlpool. So with that information, I can just simply change the wrong hashing algorithm being used with the correct one. Click enter, and as you can see, once again, John the Ripper is able to crack the hash pretty quick, mainly because we have a very weak password of Carlos. Now I want to show you how to crack hashes using Singe Crack Mode. With Singe Crack Mode, John the Ripper will create its own word list based on its default rules. With Singe Crack Mode, John the Ripper will create variants of our user. For example, it might try Carlos like this, Carlos like this, or maybe Carlos like this. And then it will hash it using the hashing algorithm that we specify with the format flag. Once it has the hash, it will compare it to the hash that we have inside our file. Once it has a match, it knows that it has successfully cracked the hash. But before we do all of this, we first need to identify the hashing algorithm being used for this hash. For that, we're going to use NameThatHash. Use the F flag to specify the file containing the hash that we want to identify. Click enter, and as you can see, according to NameThatHash, our hashing algorithm is SHA-256. And here's the format for John the Ripper. Now, before we begin with John the Ripper, we first need to edit our hash file and add the name of the user that this hash belongs to. So we're going to say Carlos and then separate the name and hash by a colon. Save the file. And now we can begin with John the Ripper. We're going to say John, single, use the format flag to specify the hashing algorithm being used. And finally specify the file containing the name of the user and hash. And as you can see, this is our password. Now let's move on to cracking password protected zip files. If we try to open this zip file, you're going to see that it is password protected. In order for us to crack this file, we're going to have to convert it to a format that John the Ripper can understand. For this, we're going to say zip to John, specify our zip file, and redirect the output to a file. Once we have a file that John the Ripper can understand, we can say John, use the word list flag to specify a word list. And finally, specify the file we just created. Click enter, and John the Ripper will be able to crack the password. Now, if we try to open the zip file, copy the password and paste it, we're going to be able to access the file. And that's how you crack a zip file. Now let's move on to cracking RAR files. Now, cracking RAR files is exactly the same as cracking zip files, but instead of using zip to John, we're going to use RAR to John, specify our RAR file, and redirect the output to a file. Once we have a file that John the Ripper can understand, we can once again say John, use the word list flag to specify our word list. And finally, indicate the file that we just created. Click enter. And as you can see, John the Ripper is able to crack the password. If we try to open the RAR file, copy the password we just cracked, paste it, we are able to access the contents of the file. Now let's move on to cracking SSH keys. Now cracking SSH keys is almost identical to cracking RAR or zip files. If you don't know what an ID RSA key is, it's a way of authenticating via SSH. Instead of having to specify your password, all you have to do is specify the ID RSA key. That being said, in order for us to crack it, we're going to have to convert it to a file format that John the Ripper can understand. For that, we're going to say SSH to John, specify our key, and redirect the output to a file that John the Ripper can understand. Once you have that file, we can say John, use the word list flag to specify our word list, and finally specify the file we just created. And as you can see, John the Ripper is able to crack the password for our ID RSA key. Now let's move on to cracking etc password and etc shadow files. Now, if you're not familiar with etc password and etc shadow files, they contain information about system users. For example, we have a root user. The X indicates that the hash for the root user is inside of the etc shadow file. This is the UID, group ID, home directory, and the type of shell they have. Now, if we read the shadow file, we have the user and its hash. Now, etc password files are viewable by all system users, but etc shadow files are visible by root or by other users with sudo privileges. There are other ways to get access to the shadow file, for example, weak file permissions. But we're not going to get into that. In order for John to be able to crack these files, we're going to have to combine them. For that, we can use unshadow, specify our password file and our shadow file so that John the Ripper can combine them and redirect the output to a file that John the Ripper can understand. If we read the file we just created, as you can see, unshadow has combined the two files. Once this is done, we can once again say John, word list, user, share, word list, rock.txt, and specify the file we just created. Click enter and John the Ripper will try to crack it. As you can see, the password was this long string of numbers. Now I want to mention that John the Ripper may need you to identify the hashing algorithm being used for the user. For that, we can copy the hash, write it to a file, and use NameThatHash with the F flag to specify the file containing the hash that you want to identify. And once you have the hashing algorithm being used, we can simply use the format flag and paste the hashing algorithm being used. Click enter and John the Ripper should work. In our case, our hash has already been cracked, so John the Ripper will no longer crack it. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this video.